The trunk hit the platform board so hard, the latch popped open, spilling her mother's old shawl into the dust. Willie Dawson didn't move to pick it up. She couldn't. Not with 200 eyes on her back, and James Walton's voice still ringing across the station. "You are not what I asked for." The train was already pulling away, taking her last $12 worth of hope with it. She had crossed a continent to be chosen. Instead, she'd been discarded in broad daylight. But the worst humiliation of her life was about to become the first step of a new one. If you're watching this from your own hometown, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like Willie's speak to you, hit subscribe now, because you won't want to miss where this one goes. The shawl lay in the dirt for 11 full seconds before anyone said a word. Willie counted them. She didn't know why. Maybe because counting was the only thing her mind would let her do, the only task small enough to hold on to, while the rest of her world came apart on a train platform in the middle of Arizona territory. 1, 2, 3. The whistle screamed behind her long and final, and she felt the ground tremble as the cars began to roll. 4, 5, 6. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman laughed. Not loud. Not cruel enough to be called out for it. Just a small, satisfied sound, the kind people make when they've been proven right about something. 7, 8. "You are not what I asked for." The words wouldn't stop playing. James Walton had said them plain, no shame in his voice at all, like he was returning a crate of spoiled peaches to the mercantile. 9, 10, 11. Willie bent down and picked up the shawl herself. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to fold it. Nobody offered to help. Nobody met her eyes. The station platform of Copper Creek had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of people who wanted to watch something terrible without being blamed for watching. "Ma'am." The station master's voice, careful, apologetic in a way that didn't cost him anything. "Trains departed. Next one through comes Thursday." "Thursday," Willie repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked down at the trunk. Everything she owned in the world was inside it. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a tin of hairpins, and a folded letter with James Walton's handwriting on it. The very letter that had promised her a home, a husband, a life that wasn't this. "Miss Dawson, I have built a fine house, and I am in need of a wife to keep it. I am told you are capable and God-fearing. I will meet the train." He had met the train. He had looked at her. Really looked the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying. Walking a slow circle around her while she stood frozen with her hands folded in front of her good traveling dress. And then he had said it. "You are not what I asked for." Someone in the crowd murmured, "Well, can't rightly blame him. Man wrote for a wife, not a—" "Hush now." Another voice cut in, not unkind but not kind either, just embarrassed. Everyone there was embarrassed, and none of them for the right reasons. Willie Dawson stood in the center of it with her spine straight, because her mother had taught her that a woman keeps her spine straight, even when the whole world is trying to bend her double, and she thought, "I will not cry here. I will not give them that too." But her eyes burned anyway, and one tear escaped and ran hot down her cheek before she could stop it, and she heard the woman who'd laughed before make a small satisfied sound again, like she'd been rewarded. $12. Willie said out loud to no one, because she needed to hear a voice, and hers was the only one available to her. She opened her reticule and counted the bills with fingers that still trembled. $12 and a train that don't come again till Thursday. "There's a boarding house 2 streets down," the station master offered. "Mrs. Pruitt runs it. Mike could take you in." For $12. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Everyone standing there knew a room in town would eat through her money in 4 nights, maybe 5 if she skipped meals, and then what? Then nothing. Then a woman with no husband, no family, and no ticket home, alone in a territory she'd never set foot in before that morning. James Walton was already 3 streets away by then, walking toward his wagon like a man who'd settled a minor business dispute and wanted his supper. He hadn't looked back once. Willie watched him go, and felt something in her chest crack clean down the middle, and it wasn't her heart breaking over a man she'd never loved. She hadn't known him long enough to love him, had only known his letters, careful and businesslike, promising a fair arrangement. What broke was something older than that. Something that had been cracking slow for years, ever since she was 17, and Thomas Ainsley told her gently, so gently, that he couldn't rightly present her to his mother on account of, well, you understand, Willie, don't you? She had understood. She had spent 9 years understanding. Understanding why men's eyes slid past her at church socials. Why her own aunt used to sigh over her the way a woman sighs over a debt that won't ever come due. She had crossed the entire country on the strength of one letter that promised she might finally be enough for somebody. And she had lasted 4 seconds on the platform before that promise was returned to sender. "Ma'am, you oughtn't stand out here," the station master said. "Sun's fixing to get hot." "Where would you have me stand instead?" Willie asked, and there was an edge in it now, thin but real, the first sign of the woman underneath the humiliation. "You tell me a place in this town that wants me, sir, and I will gladly stand there." He had no answer. Nobody did. That was when the horse came around the corner of the depot, easy and unhurried like its rider had all the time in the world and intended to use every minute of it. Lucas Reed didn't look like a man in a hurry ever. He sat his horse the way some men sit in church pews they've occupied their whole lives, settled, unbothered entirely, certain of his right to be exactly where he was. He'd heard the commotion from half a mile off the particular pitch of a crowd enjoying somebody else's disaster, and something in him had turned toward it before he'd even decided to. He took in the scene in about 2 seconds. The trunk in the dirt, the shawl refolded now but still dusty at the hem. The woman standing straight-backed in the middle of a crowd that had already decided her fate and was only waiting to see how she'd take it. He didn't dismount right away. He just looked the way Willie had been looked at all morning, except this time it didn't feel like being measured for rejection. It felt like being seen. "Somebody want to tell me what happened here?" Lucas asked, and his voice carried without him raising it, which was its own kind of authority. "Walton's bride," someone offered, half laughing. Didn't suit him. "That's so." Lucas swung down off the horse, slow, deliberate, and walked toward Willie with his hat still on, which some might have called rude, except that the way he did it made it clear he wasn't performing manners for the crowd. He stopped a respectful 3 feet from her, and finally tipped the hat back just enough to look her full in the face. "Ma'am," he said. "You all right?" Nobody had asked her that, not once in the whole ugly hour. Willie's chin came up another half-inch, pride fighting the tremor still living in her hands. "I am standing upright, sir, which is more than some men in this town can manage in the way of decency." A few people laughed at that real laughter, surprised out of them, and Lucas's mouth moved not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one. "Can't argue that," he said. "Name's Lucas Reed. I run the Double R about 6 miles west. Wilhelmina Dawson." She said it like a challenge, like she expected the name itself to be rejected next. "Miss Dawson. Not as it turns out, Mrs. Walton." "I gathered." Lucas looked past her briefly toward the direction Walton had walked off in, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger, but was standing close to it. "Man wrote you across the whole country and didn't have the decency to say his piece in private. He said his piece plain enough, Mr. Reed, in front of God and half of Copper Creek. That don't make it decent, just makes it public." Willie hadn't expected that. She'd expected pity, maybe, or worse, the particular brand of politeness people used on someone they felt sorry for, and slightly disgusted by in equal measure. She hadn't expected a man to sound angry on her behalf, like her humiliation was an insult to more than just her. "I don't need your opinion on his manners." "Mr. Reed," she said, because pride was the only thing she had left, and she wasn't about to hand it over too. "I need a train that isn't scheduled till Thursday, and a way to survive till it comes." Lucas nodded slow, like he'd been expecting that answer, like he'd already been turning something over in his mind before he'd even gotten off the horse. "I've got a proposition then. You want to hear it, or you'd rather I mind my business?" "At this point, sir, I am fresh out of business worth minding. Say your piece." "I need a housekeeper out at the Double R. Cook keep the accounts straight, run the house proper. Man who did it before me moved on. I've been eating burnt beans for a month, and my ledgers look like a dog got into the ink." A ripple went through the crowd. At that, not quite a laugh, but close. And Willie felt her face go hot, because she understood exactly what was being offered, and exactly what it wasn't. "You're offering me work?" she said carefully. "Not marriage. I'm offering you work. $3 a week, a room to yourself, meals included. No conditions beyond doing the job." "That's a fair wage for a housekeeper," Willie said. And there was suspicion in it now, because nothing that morning had been fair, and she'd learned fast that kindness offered free of charge usually came with a bill hidden somewhere in the fine print. Why would you offer that to a woman you don't know, in front of a whole town that just watched her get thrown away like spoiled meat? Lucas's jaw tightened at that phrase, spoiled meat, like it cost him something to hear her say it about herself. "Because I need help, and you're standing here needing work, and I don't see the sense in you starving on a platform for 3 days waiting on a train while my kitchen falls apart 6 miles that away. Seems like a plain trade to me." "Plain trades don't usually come with an audience, Mr. Reed." "No," he agreed. "They don't. But you didn't have the luxury of a private conversation this morning, so I don't reckon you'll hold it against me if this one happens in the open too." That landed somewhere soft in her, some place that had been bruised raw an hour ago and wasn't fully healed. She looked at him, really looked the way he'd looked at her, and saw a man, maybe 35, weathered by sun and work, not handsome in the way that magazines drew handsome, but solid, steady. The kind of face that didn't seem built for lying. "And if I say no, then you say no, and I tip my hat and ride on, and you're no worse off than you were 5 minutes ago standing in this dirt." It was the honesty of that answer that decided her more than the wage or the room, or the promise of meals. He wasn't begging her to come. He wasn't pretending it was charity either. He was laying out a fact and letting her choose what to do with it. And after a morning where a man had looked her over and pronounced her not what he asked for, being handed an actual choice felt like being handed something precious. "There's more, isn't there?" Willie said, because she'd learned that morning that men's offers rarely stopped where they first said they would. "I can see it on your face, Mr. Reed. Out with it." Lucas was quiet a second, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped lower, meant just for her, though half the platform was still straining to hear. "Town's small. Word travels faster than the train does. A woman living alone at my ranch, unmarried, working for a bachelor rancher that's going to get talked about ugly, and ugly talk in a place this size can ruin a woman's name before she's even unpacked her trunk. I'm aware of how towns talk, Mr. Reed. I believe I demonstrated a working knowledge of the subject not 20 minutes ago." That earned the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him, yet quick and gone. "Yes, ma'am, you did. So here's my thinking, and you can tell me it's foolish if you like. Nobody in Copper Creek needs to know you're my housekeeper. Easier and safer for your name if they believe you're my wife." The crowd, which had been pretending not to listen this whole time, gave up all pretense at that and leaned in outright. Willie stared at him. "Your wife. In name only as far as the town's concerned. Nothing more asked of you than what I already said, cooking, keeping the house, the accounts. But it'd be Mrs. Reed on paper, as far as anybody here knows, and that keeps the wolves off you. Man who tries to speak ill of another man's wife finds himself short a few teeth around these parts. Nobody bothers a housekeeper the same way, not out here. You're asking me to lie. I'm asking you to let this town believe something that protects you after it already watched you get humiliated for the truth. Seems to me the truth didn't do you many favors this morning, Miss Dawson." That struck deep because it was true. And true things had a way of finding the soft parts of a person, no matter how a body tried to armor against them. Willie looked down at her trunk, at the shawl folded crooked on top of it, at the $12 she'd need to somehow stretch across 3 days if she refused this stranger's offer. "You didn't ask my permission before you decided this, Mr. Reed. You're only asking now after you've already told me your plan whole." "That's fair criticism. I got ahead of myself. But I'm asking now, and you're free to say no, and I'll figure another way to handle the talk if you do. Man before me, quit the job, not the plan. I can find a different lie if this one don't suit you." There was something almost funny in that, the plainness of it, and despite everything, despite the ache still sitting behind her ribs where Walton's words had landed, Willie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "You are a very strange man, Mr. Reed." "I've been told that by better authorities than yourself, ma'am, and lived through it fine." The station master cleared his throat. "Train I mentioned, ma'am, only one till Thursday, like I said. And boarding house rates being what they are." "I heard you the first time," Willie said sharper than she meant, and then caught herself softened it. "Forgive me, this has been a trying morning." "Understandable, ma'am." She turned back to Lucas Reed, who hadn't moved, hadn't crowded her, hadn't done a single thing since dismounting that a careful woman could call improper. He stood there with his hat back in place, now waiting patient, as a fence post letting her arrive at her own decision without pushing her toward it. $3 a week, she said. $3. A room of my own, a door that locks. Every door in my house locks, ma'am, including yours, and the key stays with you, not me. And this arrangement, the pretending it ends whenever I say it ends. If I want the town to know the truth of it one day, that's my choice to make, not yours." "Agreed." Willie looked down one more time at the shawl at the trunk, at the small, pathetic pile of everything she had left in the world, and thought of the woman who'd laughed at her not 10 minutes before, and thought of James Walton's back as he walked away without once turning around, and thought that whatever waited for her 6 miles west at the Double R Ranch, it could not possibly humiliate her worse than what Copper Creek had already done in broad daylight with an audience. "All right, Mr. Reed," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own small victory. "I accept your offer, all parts of it." Something eased in his shoulders, small but visible, like he'd been half expecting her to refuse, and was relieved she hadn't. "Then let's get your trunk loaded," he said, and reached for it before she could protest that she was capable of managing her own belongings, except when his hands closed around the handles. He paused and looked up at her first. "May I?" Nobody had asked her permission for anything that whole morning. Not Walton, who'd decided her fate without a word of warning. Not the crowd who'd decided her worth without consulting her at all. Just this stranger asking if he could carry her trunk. "You may," Willie said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the words, the first real crack in her composure since the shawl had hit the dirt, and she pressed her lips together hard and looked away toward the mountains so nobody would see her eyes fill again. Lucas noticed anyway. He didn't say anything about it, didn't offer some clumsy comfort that would only embarrass them both. He simply hefted the trunk onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing and said in a voice pitched only for her, "Wagon's just past the depot. Won't take but a minute." "Thank you," Willie managed. "Don't thank me yet," Lucas said, and there was something dry in it, almost a joke, though his eyes stayed serious. "You haven't tasted my cooking. Once you do, you'll understand you're the one doing me the favor." It was such a small thing to say, so plain and unremarkable, but it was the first thing anyone had said to her all morning that didn't carry judgment folded inside it. And Willie found herself walking a half step behind him, toward the wagon, with something loosening in her chest that she hadn't felt since Boston. Since before Boston, if she was honest, since before Thomas Ainsley and his mother, and 9 years of being looked over and looked past. Behind them, the crowd on the platform was already talking, already reshaping the morning's humiliation into something new and stranger. Reed's taken up with Walton's leftover bride. "Would you look at that? Didn't take him 10 minutes. And Willie heard the words drift after her on the wind and felt for the first time that day that she did not care one bit what any of them thought. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for Lucas's hand, because she still had that much pride left in her, and settled her skirts and looked straight ahead down the road west, away from Copper Creek's platform and James Walton's cold appraisal, and every pair of eyes that had watched her get discarded like something unwanted. "You're quiet," Lucas said, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. "I am considering." Willie said, "How strange a morning can turn. I woke today believing I was traveling toward a wedding. I did not expect to end the day traveling toward a stranger's ranch as his pretend wife instead." "Strange mornings don't always mean bad ones," Lucas said, clicking the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying her away from the platform, where she'd been broken, and toward whatever waited for her past the hills. "We'll see Mr. Reed." "Lucas," he said. "If we're to be married in the town's eyes, seems foolish to keep calling each other by surnames." "Lucas, then." She tested the name, found it sat easier on her tongue than she expected. "And you'll call me Willie. Wilhelmina is a mouthful nobody's had patience for since my mother passed." "Willie," he repeated like he was setting the name carefully into some drawer in his mind where he intended to keep it. "All right, Willie, welcome to the Double R." She looked out at the wide, dry country unrolling ahead of them, mountains standing blue and distant against a sky that seemed too big for the small hurt still sitting in her chest, and she thought of the shawl in the dirt of the 11 seconds she'd counted before anyone spoke of James Walton's back as he walked away. "You are not what I asked for." Maybe not, Willie thought, watching Lucas Reed's steady hands on the reins, feeling the wagon carry her toward a life she hadn't planned on and couldn't yet see the shape of. Maybe she wasn't what James Walton had asked for, but something in her, some stubborn ember that hadn't gone out despite 9 years of being overlooked, whispered that perhaps she hadn't yet met the man who would ask for exactly what she was. The road stretched on dust, rising soft behind the wagon wheels, and Copper Creek fell away behind them, smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely into the folds of the land, taking its cruelty with it, and leaving Willie Dawson to face whatever waited for her next, with her spine still straight, and her trunk safely stowed, and a strange, careful hope beginning to stir where humiliation had been sitting only an hour before. The wagon crested a low rise, and Lucas nodded toward the valley opening up below them. "Double R," he said. "Been in my family since before the war." Willie said nothing for a moment, taking in the sprawl of it. The house low and solid, the barn beyond it, the fence lines stretching farther than she could easily follow. It was bigger than she'd pictured. Bigger than anything she'd managed in Boston, where her aunt's household had been 3 rooms and a temper that filled every corner of them. "It's a lot of house for one bachelor," she said. "It's a lot of house for one bachelor who can't cook and won't sew a button back on his own shirt," Lucas said, "which is half the reason you're sitting where you're sitting. And the other half—" He didn't answer that right away, and Willie found she didn't push. There would be time for the other half, later she suspected. There was always more to a man's reasons than he offered up on a first ride. The wagon rolled down into the yard, and a dog came tearing off the porch barking with more enthusiasm than menace, circling the wheels twice before settling into a trot alongside them. "That's Bandit," Lucas said. "He'll warm to you faster than the ranch hands will. Lower his standards considerably." "Comforting," Willie said dryly, and caught out of the corner of her eye, Lucas's mouth twitching again in that almost smile he seemed to keep on a short leash. 2 men were coming out of the barn as the wagon pulled up, wiping their hands on rags, and Willie felt her spine straighten instinctively, bracing for the same look Walton had given her, the same slow cataloging appraisal that ended in judgment. It didn't come. The older of the two, a weathered man with a gray mustache and eyes that crinkled easy, just looked at her the way a man looks at any new arrival. Curious, not cruel. "This the housekeeper you went for?" he asked Lucas. "This is Mrs. Reed," Lucas said, and the words landed strange in Willie's ears, foreign, though she'd agreed to them not 2 hours before. "Willie, this is Amos Fielding, my foreman. Runs this place better than I do most days, if I'm honest." "Ma'am," Amos said, and tipped his hat easy as anything, like there was nothing at all remarkable about it. The younger man beside him, lanky, maybe 19, looked between Lucas and Willie with open confusion. "Thought you weren't the marrying kind, boss." "Wasn't," Lucas said. "Man can change his mind." "That was fast. Some things don't need to be slow to be sure, Danny." Lucas swung down off the wagon and came around to help Willie, offering his hand up to her this time without asking permission first. And Willie took it because refusing would have meant a clumsy climb down in her traveling skirts in front of an audience, and she'd had quite enough of audiences for one day. "Ma'am," Danny said again, ducking his head, still visibly working through the sudden appearance of a wife where no wife had existed that morning. "Mrs. Reed," Willie corrected gently, testing the lie's weight on her own tongue for the first time. "Will do fine, Danny." Amos was watching the two of them with something sharper in his eyes than Danny's easy confusion, something that suggested he'd lived long enough on this earth to recognize a thing that didn't quite add up when he saw it. But he didn't say anything. He just nodded once, slow filing it away. "Kitchen's this way," Lucas said, hefting Willie's trunk again without being asked, and led her toward the house. The inside told her everything Lucas hadn't said aloud. A month of neglect sat in every corner, dishes stacked wrong, a fine layer of dust on surfaces that should have been wiped daily, the particular staleness of a house where nobody had opened the windows with intention in longer than anyone cared to admit. "I did warn you," Lucas said, watching her take it in. "You did not warn me sufficiently," Willie said, already moving toward the stove, running a finger along its surface and grimacing at what came away on her glove. "This is not a kitchen, Mr. Reed. This is a crime scene." "Lucas," he corrected. "And I'll take the criticism. Man, before you left in a hurry, and I've been getting by on beans and biscuits I burn more often than not." "I can see that," Willie said, eyeing a scorched pot sitting abandoned in the sink. "This looks like evidence. You planning to prosecute?" "I'm planning to civilize Mr. Lucas. There's a difference, though. In this case, the line may be thin." She set her gloves aside and rolled her sleeves without waiting for further invitation. Some old instinct in her rising to meet a mess, the way another woman might rise to meet a compliment gratefully, eagerly like this at least, was something she knew how to fix. "Where do you keep your ledgers? You mentioned your accounts were troubled." "Willie, you just walked in the door. You don't have to—" "Mr. Reed." She turned to face him fully, and something in her posture had changed already, the humiliation of the morning folding itself away beneath something more practical, more useful. "You offered me a job. I intend to do it well. Show me the ledgers." He studied her a moment, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen from a man in longer than she could remember. Not pity, not the careful patience people extended to a woman they'd already dismissed, but something closer to respect, tentative and testing, like he wasn't yet sure if it was warranted, but was willing to extend it on credit. "Study back room," he said. "I'll show you." The ledgers, when she finally sat with them at the study desk that evening, were exactly as bad as promised. Worse, in places numbers crossed out and rewritten in the margins. Whole weeks unaccounted for a debt to the feed store that Lucas clearly hadn't tallied against what he was owed by two neighboring ranches for shared grazing rights. "You're owed money," Willie said, tracing a column with her finger. "Right here. The Hendricks place owes you for grazing since March, and you've been paying the feed store as though you owe them full price when half of this feed was traded, not bought." "That's so." "That is very much so, Mr. Reed. You are hemorrhaging money because you cannot be bothered to write down what happens on your own land. I've got a ranch to run, cattle to move, fences to mend. I don't exactly have leisure hours to sit with a pen." "Then it's fortunate," Willie said, not looking up from the page, "that you now have someone who does." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You did this kind of thing before accounts. My father kept books for a shipping concern in Boston before he passed. I did his sums for him the last 2 years of his life when his eyes started failing. Nobody thought much of teaching a woman figures beyond what she'd need to run a household. But I learned more than that because he needed the help, and I was there to give it. Seems a waste of mind like that going unused just because nobody thought to put it to work." Something in Willie's chest tightened at that unexpected and unwelcome, because it was the kind of sentence a person said when they meant it plainly and didn't realize how rare plain kindness had become in her life. "Most people," she said carefully, "look at a woman my size and decide what she's capable of before she's said a single word. I have found it easier over the years not to expect otherwise." Lucas was quiet a moment. "That how it was with Walton. Walton never asked me a single question about myself in 3 weeks of letters, Mr. Reed. He asked if I could cook, if I could sew, and if I was godly. I answered all 3 honestly. I did not think to mention I could balance a ledger because he never thought to ask, and I imagine it wouldn't have mattered to him regardless." "It matters to me," Lucas said. And then, as though hearing how that sounded, added, "The books, I mean, matters to the ranch." "Of course," Willie said, and let the moment pass without comment. Though something in her had noted, the stumble filed it away, the way Amos had filed away his own quiet observations in the yard. She worked past dark that first night, and Lucas brought her coffee without being asked, setting it down at her elbow and retreating before she could thank him properly. And by the time she finally set the pen down, her fingers ached and her eyes burned, but the ledger in front of her told a story that made sense for the first time in months. Debts reconciled, credits accounted for the full shape of the ranch's troubles laid out plain instead of buried in scratched-out numbers. "You've been overpaying the feed store by nearly $11 a month," she told him when he came to check on her progress. "And Hendricks owes you closer to 40 than the 20 you'd guessed. I'll draft the letters tomorrow if you'll tell me you're comfortable with a woman handling your correspondence." "Ma'am, at this point, I'd be comfortable with you handling my last will and testament." "Don't tempt me, Mr. Reed. I've had a long day." That surprised a real laugh out of him, short and rough, like it hadn't been used in a while, and Willie found herself smiling too unguarded before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back into something more composed. It had been a long time since a man's laughter had felt like a gift rather than a judgment. By the end of her first week, Willie had turned her attention to the pantry, which proved nearly as troubled as the ledgers had been. Flour gone weevily in a corner, nobody had checked in months, tins stacked without order. A store of dried beans that had clearly been purchased in a panic and never properly rotated. "This is worse than the books," she announced, standing amid the wreckage with her sleeves rolled and a rag tied over her hair. "Mr. Reed, did anyone manage this pantry at all? Or did the previous housekeeper simply fling supplies at the shelves and hope for the best?" "Man's name was Cobb," Lucas said, leaning in the doorway with poorly hidden amusement. "Good with cattle, less good with flour weevils, evidently." "Evidently," Willie agreed, already sorting the salvageable from the ruined with brisk efficiency. "I'll need a proper inventory list, and I'll want to speak to whoever handles your supply orders, because at this rate, you're either buying too much of what spoils fast or too little of what you actually need." "That'd be me too." "Of course it would." She didn't look up, already scrubbing at a shelf with more force than strictly necessary. "Add it to the list of things I intend to correct, Mr. Reed, right alongside your accounts and your cooking." "You're a formidable woman, Willie Dawson." "Reed," she corrected, glancing up at him with something sharp and amused in her expression. "If we're keeping up appearances in front of a weevil infestation, you may as well practice the name properly." He laughed again, and Danny, passing by with an armload of firewood, paused just long enough to grin at the pair of them before continuing on. Already half convinced, Willie suspected that whatever this arrangement truly was, it looked considerably warmer than most marriages he'd witnessed growing up. The pantry took the better part of 2 days to fully set right, and by the time she'd finished, Willie found herself standing back with genuine satisfaction, surveying rows of properly labeled tins and neatly stacked sacks, thinking that there was a particular peace in restoring order to chaos, in taking something broken and making it function again, that no amount of polite Boston conversation had ever offered her. It was that same satisfaction 3 days later that carried her into the yard to confront a stranger she did not recognize, a broad-shouldered man leaning against the corral fence with the easy insolence of someone who knew he had no business being there and didn't much care. "Help you with something?" Willie asked, wiping her hands on her apron, keeping her voice level despite the unfamiliar prickle of alarm crawling up her spine. "Just admiring the property, ma'am." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Croft sends his regards. Says it's a shame fine land like this caught up in boundary confusion that oughtn't be so complicated to settle." "I don't believe I caught your name, sir." "Didn't offer it." He pushed off the fence unhurried, and something in his posture reminded her uncomfortably of James Walton's slow appraising circle on the train platform, except this time the appraisal wasn't of her worth as a bride, but of the ranch's worth as a prize. "Just passing a message along. Mr. Croft's a patient man, but even patient men run short eventually. Might do this household some good to consider a fair settlement before things get complicated in ways nobody much enjoys. I'll pass your message to Mr. Reed," Willie said, keeping her chin level, though her heart hammered hard against her ribs, along with my own observation that trespassing on a man's property to deliver veiled threats seems a poor way to negotiate anything fairly. The man's smile thinned. Feisty for a housekeeper. I am considerably more than a housekeeper, sir, as you'll find if Mr. Croft continues down whatever path he's currently walking. She held his gaze steady, refusing to be the first to look away. And after a long moment, the man tipped his hat with mocking politeness and swung up onto a horse she hadn't noticed tethered nearby, riding off toward the western boundary without another word. She told Lucas the moment he returned that evening and watched his face go hard and still, in a way she'd only seen once before at the mercantile counter with Mrs. Pruitt. He came onto the property, spoke to you directly. I handled it, Lucas. That's not the point, Willie, and you know it isn't. His voice was tight controlled, in the way of a man working hard to keep something larger contained. Croft's sending men onto my land to intimidate you now, not just cutting fence in the dark where nobody has to look him in the eye. That's a different kind of danger, and I don't care for it 1 inch. Nor do I, if it's any comfort. Willie admitted some of her earlier steadiness cracking, now that the immediate danger had passed and left only its aftershock. I confess, it frightened me more than I let on in the moment, standing there alone with a stranger who looked at this ranch the way men have always looked at me, like something to be acquired rather than respected. Lucas crossed the distance between them before she'd finished the sentence, and for a moment Willie thought he might reach for her, might close the space entirely, but he stopped himself just short, hands curling into fists at his sides, instead restraint costing him something visible. Nobody looks at you like that while I've got breath in me to stop it, he said low and fierce. Not Croft's men, not Walton, not anybody in this territory who thinks a woman's worth is theirs to appraise. Willie felt something crack open in her chest at the ferocity of it. Some old careful door she'd kept shut for 9 years, creaking on its hinges, and she had to look away toward the window to keep her composure from slipping entirely. You keep saying things like that, Mr. Reed, she said softly. And I begin to wonder whether you mean them as a friend protecting his housekeeper, or as something else entirely. Lucas didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough to mean something all its own. I reckon, he said, finally quiet, that I stopped knowing the difference somewhere around the second week, Willie. Didn't seem worth troubling myself over which was which, so long as you were safe and this house felt more like a home than it has in years. Willie didn't trust herself to answer that properly, so she busied herself instead with the supper she'd left half prepared, and if her hands weren't entirely steady as she worked, she told herself it was only the fright of the afternoon still working its way out of her system. Amos brought the fence-cutting ledger to her 2 nights later, gruff as always, but with something gentler underneath it. Figured you'd want this kept proper, seeing as you're the one keeping all the other records straight around here. Thank you, Amos. Don't thank me. He set the book down and lingered a moment, turning his hat in his hands the way Danny so often did. Been on this ranch 3 years, Mrs. Reed. Never seen the boss laugh the way he's laughed this past fortnight. Never seen him near as easy in his own house, neither. Whatever this arrangement started, as I expect, it's grown into something worth protecting in its own right. Is that your roundabout way of telling me you approve, Mr. Fielding? Might be, Amos said, and the closest thing to a smile Willie had yet seen from him crossed his weathered face before he tipped his hat and left her to her ledgers. That first night at supper, 4 plates had sat at a long table built for a bigger family than the one currently occupying it. Amos said, grace short and unadorned, and Danny ate like a man who'd been raised believing food might disappear if he didn't move fast enough. And Lucas watched Willie's cooking vanish off every plate, with something like relief written plain across his face. Best meal this table's seen in a month, Amos had said, wiping his mouth. No offense to your cooking, boss, but a man can only eat so many burnt beans before he starts dreaming of anything else. None taken, Lucas said. I know my limitations. You have several, Willie said, refilling his coffee without being asked. But I expect we'll manage to correct the ones that matter most. Danny had laughed around a mouthful of biscuit, and even Amos's mustache had twitched, with something like amusement, and Willie had felt for the first time in longer than she could easily remember that she'd said something clever and been met with warmth instead of the careful silence that usually followed a woman speaking too freely at a table full of men. Barely a week after the fence cutting, Danny had come to the study door, holding his hat in both hands, turning it in slow circles, the way a boy does when he's screwing up courage for something. "Mrs. Reed, can I ask you something might sound foolish?" "You may ask Danny. I reserve judgment on the foolishness until I've heard it. Amos says you used to keep books for a shipping business. Reckon you might teach me my letters proper. Never had much schooling. Can read some, but numbers give me trouble, and I don't like feeling stupid in front of the boss when he asks me to tally a herd." "You are not stupid, Danny, for lacking schooling nobody offered you. Bring your ledger book after supper. We'll start with simple sums and work up from there." That evening, after the dishes were cleared, Lucas had found the two of them at the kitchen table, leaning in the doorway unnoticed for a long moment, before either of them realized he was watching. "Didn't figure you for a school teacher too, on top of everything else," he'd said, once Danny had finally gone off to bed, grinning ear to ear over a page of correctly summed figures. "I am not a school teacher, Mr. Reed. I am a woman, helping a boy who asked for help. You're good at it, patient. I had a patient father once." Lucas had settled into the chair across from her. "You don't talk much about your family." "There isn't much left to talk about. My father passed 6 years back, my mother before that. An aunt in Boston who was glad enough to see me married off and out of her house, since a plain woman my size wasn't exactly drawing suitors to her door, and every unmarried year I spent under her roof felt to her like a debt I owed and couldn't repay." "That why you answered Walton's advertisement?" "I answered it because I was tired, Lucas. Tired of being spoken of like a burden nobody had figured out how to unload. I didn't love him. I don't believe I even much liked him from his letters alone. But I hoped foolishly, perhaps, that a fresh start might mean a fresh chance at being seen as something other than a problem waiting to be solved." "You're not a problem," Lucas had said, quiet certain. "You've known me 3 weeks, Mr. Reed. You may yet revise that opinion?" "I don't expect I will." 2 weeks into her new life at the Double R, Willie rode into town alone for the first time, entrusted with the ranch's mail and a short list of supplies, and found herself face to face entirely by accident with James Walton himself, stepping out of the bank with a satisfied set to his shoulders that made her stomach turn cold. "Miss Dawson," he said, and then corrected himself with obvious distaste. "I hear it's Mrs. Reed now. That was fast work even for a woman in your position." Willie felt every eye on the street shift toward them, felt the old humiliation rise hot in her throat, but she had spent 2 weeks under Lucas Reed's steady example, and something in her had learned, however recently, that a spine could be held straight, even when the ground beneath it felt uncertain. "It is Mrs. Reed, Mr. Walton, and I'll thank you to address me properly. As for the speed of it, I imagine a man in your position understands better than most how quickly circumstances change when the parties involved actually value each other's worth." Walton's face reddened. "I meant no insult." "You meant precisely an insult, sir, same as you meant one on the platform 3 weeks past when you looked me over like livestock and found me wanting in front of half this town. Good day." She walked past him with her chin high, and it was only once she'd rounded the corner toward the Mercantile that her hands began to shake, the adrenaline of the confrontation catching up with her all at once. She didn't tell Lucas about the encounter that evening. Amos told him anyway, and by breakfast the next morning, Lucas was waiting with an expression she couldn't read. "Walton spoke to you in town yesterday. Amos heard it from the blacksmith's boy." "I handled it, Lucas." "I don't doubt you did. Doesn't mean I care for hearing about it secondhand instead of from you directly. We agreed to this arrangement together, Willie. That means when something happens that touches on you, I'd like to hear it from you." "I am not accustomed," she said slowly, "to anyone wanting to hear about my troubles at all, Lucas. Forgive me if I don't yet know the correct way to offer them up." Something in his face softened. "Then I suppose we're both learning something new. I've never had anyone to protect before either, not really. Not like this." "That makes 2 of us, Mr. Reed." They settled into an uneasy truce over breakfast, and it was 3 days later while Willie sat bent over the ledgers that Amos came through the door, breathless from riding hard. Crofts filed papers, he said, with the county. Formal complaint about the boundary, asking the magistrate to rule before spring roundup instead of waiting on the regular schedule. And he's asking questions about you, Mrs. Reed. Willie's pen stilled on the page. About me, about the marriage, Amos said grimly. Word is Croft sent his lawyer into Pruitt's yesterday asking casual-like whether anybody recalled attending a wedding at the R hearing bands read at church or seeing any paper filed with the county clerk. Mrs. Pruitt didn't have an answer on account of there being none to give, and that got her curious enough to start asking her own questions of anybody who'd listen. Now half the town's whispering about how long you and Lucas were really courting, whether there was ever a proper ceremony at all. Man's looking for a crack to put a wedge into, and if he finds out this marriage ain't what it claims to be, he could use it against Lucas. Willie finished understanding landing cold and immediate. Discredit the whole household. Question every decision made under this roof, every document I've helped prepare. Worse than that, Amos said. Man like Croft finds out you two lied to the whole town about something this size, he won't need the survey dispute at all. He'll have a scandal ready-made, and it lets him paint Lucas as dishonest in front of the very magistrate meant to rule on the survey fair and square. Where's Lucas? South pasture. I'll ride for him. No, Willie said, standing. I'll go myself. This concerns me as much as him, and I won't sit here waiting on news like a woman with no say in her own fate. Not again. Not ever again. She found Lucas mending fence, and the moment he saw her face, he dropped his tools and crossed the distance between them fast. What's happened? She told him everything, watching his expression darken with every word. He wants a scandal, Lucas said once she'd finished. Wants to paint me as a liar in front of the same magistrate who's supposed to rule fair on land that's rightfully mine. There's more, Amos said, catching up to them. Croft's man was seen at the county clerk's office this morning requesting copies of any marriage filing under the name Reed. Clerk told him there weren't none on record, and by sundown that fact will have traveled faster than any of us can ride. How long do we have? Days, maybe? Not weeks. Lucas dragged a hand down his face. 2 years I've held that man off with nothing but stubbornness and a fair survey on my side. Now he's found a crack that's got nothing to do with landlines at all, and it's a crack we handed him ourselves, not 3 weeks back, standing on a train platform, trying to do a kindness. Don't, Willie said sharply. Don't you dare call it a mistake, Lucas Reed. You offered a woman dignity when the whole town was ready to watch her starve for entertainment. If Harlan Croft wants to twist that decency into a weapon, the fault lies with him, not with either of us. Fault or not, Willie, it's a weapon regardless, and it's aimed square at both our heads now. Can he prove it? Is there a record anywhere that would show there was never a ceremony? There's no record, because there was never a ceremony to record, Lucas said, and the plainness of it hit them both at once. If Croft pushes hard enough, it won't take much digging before somebody admits nobody in this town ever actually witnessed us marry. There's still time, Willie said, though even to her own ears the words sounded thin. If the town believes we're simply a private couple who married quiet without ceremony, Croft won't let it rest at unusual Willie. He'll push till he finds the actual truth of it. Then perhaps, Willie said, her voice wavering despite her best effort, the solution is not to defend a lie harder, but to stop it being a lie at all. The words hung between them larger than either of them had meant to speak aloud so soon. You're saying we ought to actually marry, for real, before Croft can prove otherwise. I am saying that a real marriage cannot be exposed as a false one, Mr. Reed, whatever else it might or might not be. That's a mighty practical reason to marry a woman, Willie. It is a practical solution to a practical problem, yes. And if I told you, Lucas said low, that practicality isn't the only reason I'd want it. Willie's breath caught some old careful wall inside her creaking at the words, unwilling to trust them fully, and yet unable to dismiss them either. Then I think, Mr. Reed, that this is a conversation better suited to somewhere other than a fence line with Amos standing not 30 feet off, pretending very hard not to listen. Behind them, Amos cleared his throat loudly and turned to examine a fence post with sudden, intense interest. And despite everything, Willie felt a small, startled laugh escape her and saw an answering warmth flicker across Lucas's face before the gravity of their circumstances settled back over both of them. "Then we have a decision to make," she said quietly once the laugh had faded. "And I think, Mr. Reed, that decision can't wait for a convenient hour." Lucas looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't fully name, and the wind moved through the fence line between them. "No," he said, finally quiet and certain. "I don't suppose it can." Amos didn't wait to be dismissed. He tipped his hat, muttered something about checking on the south fence that fooled nobody, and left them standing alone in the wind with the decision hanging heavy between them. "You're certain?" Lucas said. "Not just because Crofts forced your hand. I have been certain of very little in my life, Mr. Reed, but I find myself surprisingly certain of this." Willie folded her hands in front of her, an old habit from every difficult conversation her aunt had ever forced her to sit through, though this conversation bore no resemblance to those. "I did not come west looking for love. I came looking for a place where I might be useful, might be wanted for something beyond my failures to be what somebody else asked for. I have found more of that here in 3 weeks than I found in 9 years in Boston." "That's not quite an answer to my question." "No," she admitted. "It isn't." She looked at him fully, then searching his face the way he'd searched hers at the fence line, testing whether what she saw there could be trusted. "I am saying yes because Croft has forced the timing of it, Lucas, but I would be lying if I said the timing was the only reason. You have looked at me for 3 weeks like a woman with a mind worth consulting and a spine worth respecting, and I confess I did not know how much I needed a man to look at me that way until you did it." Something shifted in his expression. Relief and want tangled together plain on his face. "Then I reckon we'd best find a preacher." "There's the small matter of doing this properly." Willie said, some of her old practicality reasserting itself even now. "If Croft's questioning whether a ceremony occurred, we cannot simply marry quiet and call it settled. We need witnesses. A record filed with the county clerk that predates any further digging he intends to do. Something no lawyer could later claim was arranged after the fact to cover a lie. Reverend Whitfield does his circuit through Copper Creek every 3rd Sunday. That's 4 days off. 4 days is longer than I'd like, given what Amos just told us, but it will have to serve. In the meantime, I suggest we make certain the whole town sees us behaving exactly as a courting couple ought to, so that whatever ceremony finally occurs looks like the natural conclusion of something already well underway, rather than a hasty patch stitched over a hole Crofts found." Lucas studied her with something like admiration. "You think like a General Willie Dawson." "I think like a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated, Mr. Reed, and has finally found a battle worth fighting properly." She allowed herself for just a moment a small smile. "Now, shall we discuss how a courting couple behaves, or would you prefer to simply follow my lead?" "I expect I'd best follow your lead. You've proven considerably better at strategy than I have." The 4 days that followed were unlike anything Willie had experienced in her adult life. Lucas walked her into town Sunday for church, offering his arm with a naturalness that surprised her, and sat beside her in the pew close enough that their shoulders brushed, and afterward lingered on the church steps, making easy conversation with neighbors, while his hand rested at the small of her back, in a way that drew eyes without drawing suspicion. "You're better at this than you let on," Willie murmured once they'd climbed back into the wagon. "I'm not pretending near as much as you might think," Lucas said, and didn't elaborate further, and Willie found she didn't need him to. Mrs. Pruitt watched them from the mercantile window with narrowed eyes, and word traveled, the way word always traveled in a town too small to keep its own secrets. And by Wednesday, even Danny reported hearing talk at the feed store that Lucas Reed had gone soft as butter over his new wife, mooning after her at church like a man 20 years younger. "Good," Willie said when Danny relayed it, trying not to let the warmth of it show too plainly on her face. "Let them talk of mooning. It's considerably better than the talk Croft's been trying to stir." Monday brought its own small crisis, sharp and unwelcome. Willie was hanging washing when she noticed a woman she didn't recognize lingering at the edge of the property, watching the house with the particular studied casualness of someone pretending not to be doing exactly what she was doing. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Willie called, setting down the basket wariness prickling up her spine after the encounter with Croft's man weeks before. "Just admiring the place," the woman said, though her eyes lingered too long on the wash line, on the neat rows of mended clothes, on every small domestic detail that might be reported back to someone with an interest in whether a genuine household truly existed here. "Heard tell, there's to be a proper wedding this Sunday coming." "There is," Willie said evenly. "Though I confess I don't believe we've met, and I'm curious how a stranger comes to know our private plans before most of Copper Creek." The woman's smile thinned, and she made some excuse about needing to be elsewhere, and Willie watched her go with a cold certainty settling in her stomach that Croft's reach extended further into the fabric of the town than she'd first realized, watching eyes planted in unexpected corners, gathering small details to be used later against them. She told Lucas that evening, and watched his jaw tighten with the particular controlled fury she'd come to recognize. "He's having us watched. Which means whatever we do between now and Sunday, we ought to assume it's being reported straight back to him. Then we give him nothing worth reporting except exactly what we want him to see." Tuesday brought word through Amos that Croft had been overheard at the saloon, boasting that no marriage performed this late in the game would hold up against a magistrate's scrutiny, that he had men prepared to swear the whole arrangement had been cooked up specifically to counter his boundary complaint. "Let him boast," Willie said, though the news settled uneasy in her chest regardless. "A man who boasts before a hearing is a man nervous about his own case, Lucas. I've seen it in shipping disputes my father handled. The loudest confidence often masks the thinnest evidence." Wednesday brought the cruelest small twist of the 4 days when Danny came running from town with news that stopped Willie cold where she stood at the stove. "Mrs. Reed, there's talk going round that you were seen in Boston with a different name entire. That you're not who you claim, that maybe this whole marriage is built on more lies than just the timing of it." Willie's hands went still on the pot she'd been stirring. "That's absurd, Danny. I am precisely who I have always claimed to be." "I know it, ma'am. I'm only telling you what's being said. Fella at the feed store heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody else. The way these things always travel, twisted worse each time it passes hands." "Croft," Lucas said, arriving in time to hear the tail end of it, his voice flat with cold fury. "Manufacturing doubt wherever truth won't serve him." "Then we answer it the same way we've answered everything else," Willie said, steadying herself. "With documents. My father's shipping records still bear my name filed with the Boston Port Authority. I'll write for copies this very day, have them arrive well before the hearing, so no lawyer of Croft's can claim I invented myself from nothing." By Thursday morning, the letter was written and sent, and Willie found herself standing at the mailbox longer than necessary, staring down the road toward town, wondering how many more small fires Croft intended to set before the hearing arrived. But Croft was not a man content to let a few days of public courtship undo his efforts, and the twist came Thursday morning, sharp and unexpected, in the form of a visit from the county sheriff himself. "Sheriff Adams," Lucas said, opening the door to find the lawman standing on the porch, hat in hand, an apology already written into the set of his shoulders. "This an official visit. Wish it weren't Lucas, but I've had a formal complaint filed against you. Cattle theft allegedly conducted with your knowledge and direction, moving stock across the boundary line onto Croft land under cover of the disputed survey." Willie felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's absurd. Lucas has lost cattle, not stolen it. 12 head cut fence 3 weeks past." "That's the story I've heard from this side of the fence, ma'am," Sheriff Adams said. "Croft's telling a different one. Says his own men caught sight of double R cattle being driven deliberate toward his land in the dead of night, and he's got 2 witnesses willing to swear to a magistrate that Lucas ordered it done, and the magistrates moved up the boundary hearing on account of these new allegations. 10 days from now, not the spring like was planned. 10 days. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, standing there with Sheriff Adams still waiting patient on the porch, Willie found the careful composure she'd held through the whole conversation beginning to crack. 10 days, Lucas, she said quietly, turning toward him. 10 days to disprove a lie, built with paid witnesses, to save a ranch you've spent your whole life building. Don't, Lucas said low, just for her, his hand finding hers briefly steady and sure, even with the sheriff standing witness to it. Don't you dare take Croft's cruelty onto your own shoulders, Willie. You've been the only thing standing between this ranch and ruin since Amos came riding in with that first bad news, and I don't intend to let a paid liar undo 6 weeks of your steady work in 10 short days. That's not the same as promising we'll win. No, he admitted. It isn't. But I can promise you this, whatever the magistrate decides, I don't regret one single day of the past 6 weeks, and I won't let Harlan Croft convince either of us that offering you dignity on that platform was ever a mistake worth taking back. Willie's breath caught, and she found herself steadying under his certainty. Then she turned back to the sheriff, composure restored the sharp clarity that had once organized her father's tangled shipping accounts, rising up to meet this new larger problem. That's not enough time to properly counter false witnesses, she said. Sheriff, might I ask what specifically these witnesses claim to have seen? Ma'am, I don't rightly think. Sheriff Adams. Willie's voice carried an authority she hadn't fully known she possessed. If 2 men are prepared to lie under oath about my husband's conduct, then the details of that lie matter a great deal, because lies constructed in a hurry rarely hold up well against careful scrutiny of small particulars. Dates, times, which direction the moon was that night. I should like the details if you're able to share them. The sheriff studied her a long moment. You always this thorough, Mrs. Reed. Always, Sheriff. It's rather the point of me. He gave her the details, and by the time he'd finished, Willie had already begun to see the shape of the lie Croft had constructed, thin in places, careless in others. The night they claimed to have witnessed this, she said once Sheriff Adams had ridden off, was a new moon, Lucas. I checked the almanac in your study not 3 days back. There would have been no moon at all that night, and no lantern light strong enough at that distance to identify cattle brands from across a boundary fence in full darkness. Lucas's expression sharpened with something between hope and fierce pride. You're certain? I am certain of an almanac, Mr. Reed, and I intend to bring that almanac before the magistrate myself, if it comes to that. The deeper twist arrived 3 days later, when Amos came riding hard into the yard. Once more, his face gray with a different kind of alarm entirely. One of the witnesses recanted, he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. Fellow by the name of Sully. Came to me this morning, scared half to death, said he never saw a thing. Said Croft's foreman paid him $5 and promised more if he'd swear to the sheriff what he was told to swear. Will he say as much before the magistrate? Willie asked, already reaching for pen and paper. Says he's afraid to. Says Croft's foreman told him plain what happens to men who take money and then change their story. Then we protect him, Lucas said immediate. Bring him here if he's willing. Croft's reach doesn't extend onto my land. Sully arrived that evening thin and jumpy, twisting his hat brim in hands that wouldn't stay still. He sat at the kitchen table like a man expecting to be struck flinching when Willie set a cup of coffee in front of him. Nobody's going to hurt you here, Mr. Sully, Willie said gently, taking the seat across from him instead of looming over him the way Lucas, pacing, anxious by the window, clearly wanted to. You've done a brave thing coming to us. He promised $5 more if I held to the story, Sully said, voice cracking. Said men who don't hold to their word with him find their credit cut off at every store in 3 counties. I got a wife and 2 young ones, ma'am. Can't afford Croft's enemies, and can't afford my own conscience neither. Tell me exactly what happened, Willie said, quiet, patient. From the beginning, plain as you remember it. Not what Croft told you to say. What actually occurred. It came slow at first, halting, but steadier as Willie asked her careful questions. And by the time Sully had finished, she'd filled 2 full pages in careful handwriting dates. The exact sum offered, the foreman's name, the precise threat leveled against him. This is enough to matter, Willie said once she'd finished. But I need to ask you something difficult, Mr. Sully. Will you say these words before the magistrate under oath with Croft's own lawyer questioning you? Sully's hands trembled around his coffee cup. If I do, and Croft finds a way around losing my family, Sheriff Adams will provide protection, Lucas said, stepping away from the window finally. You'll stay here at the ranch until the hearing, and after, if you're still afeared, I'll see you and your family set up somewhere. Croft's reach doesn't extend so easy. You have my word on that, same as I gave my word to Willie the day I met her on that platform." Sully looked between the two of them a long moment. "Man offered me a job once when nobody else in this territory would hire a fellow with my reputation for drink. I always did feel bad taking Croft's money to lie on a man I'd never once had quarrel with." "Then let that feeling guide you now," Willie said softly. The twist Willie hadn't anticipated, the deeper cruelty of Croft's design, revealed itself the following morning when Reverend Whitfield's circuit brought him through Copper Creek precisely as planned. And Lucas and Willie stood before him in the small church to finally truly marry. Only to find waiting outside, once the brief ceremony concluded, a small crowd gathered with expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. "Well, isn't this convenient timing?" came a voice from the crowd. Harlan Croft himself, finally showing his face, instead of sending his men to do it for him, stood at the edge of the churchyard with an expression of pure, satisfied malice. A wedding mere days before a hearing that questions whether any marriage existed at all. "Mr. Croft," Lucas said, stepping slightly in front of Willie, his voice deadly calm. "You're trespassing on a private ceremony. I'm standing on public ground outside a public church reed, just observing what appears to be a rather hasty correction to a rather convenient lie." "There was no lie to correct, Mr. Croft," Willie said, stepping up beside Lucas instead of hiding behind him. "There was a private arrangement between myself and my husband formalized today in the manner both our families would have wished." "Families," Croft repeated, savoring the word with cruel relish. "Funny thing about families, Mrs. Reed, they tend to attend weddings. Yours seems remarkably absent, same as any witness to whatever private arrangement you claim existed before today." The crowd murmured at that, and Willie felt old humiliation rising familiar and unwelcome. But this time was different. This time Lucas's hand found hers, steady and sure, lacing their fingers together in front of God and the whole gathered crowd. "My family," Lucas said, voice carrying clear across the churchyard, "is standing right here beside me, same as she's been standing beside me every day for the past month, handling my accounts better than any man I've hired in a decade, teaching my hands their letters, standing up to your foreman when he trespassed on my land to threaten her. If you speak ill of my wife's character again, you'll answer to me directly, and I promise you won't care for the terms of that conversation." A hush fell over the churchyard, and Croft's confident sneer flickered. It was Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, who broke the tense silence that followed, stepping forward from the crowd, with her chin lifted. "I witnessed the ceremony myself, not 20 minutes past, Mr. Croft, same as half this congregation. Reverend Whitfield performed it proper, with vows spoken clear, and a ring exchanged, same as any marriage I've ever attended. I'll not stand here and let you call it a lie in front of the very witnesses who saw it happen." "Nor will I," called another voice, and then another, until a handful of the gathered churchgoers had spoken up in agreement, and Willie felt the tide of public opinion shifting now in her favor for the first time since she'd arrived in Copper Creek territory. Croft's jaw tightened. "We'll see what the magistrate makes of your timing, Reed," he said, finally retreating with as much dignity as he could salvage. 10 days isn't so very long to wait." "No," Lucas agreed. "It isn't. Plenty of time for the truth to come out proper on both our parts." Croft's carriage rolled away, and it was only once they were alone that Willie allowed herself to lean into Lucas's side, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up with her. "That was rather more excitement than I'd planned for a wedding day," she said, and heard the tremor in her own voice. "I'd apologize," Lucas said, wrapping an arm carefully around her. "Except Croft's the one who ought to be apologizing, and I don't imagine that man's capable of it." Mrs. Pruitt approached them, then hesitant, in a way Willie had never once seen from the sharp-tongued shopkeeper, and extended a hand toward Willie almost shyly. "I owe you an apology of my own, Mrs. Reed, for the manner I spoke to you that first day in my store. I judged you unfairly, same as this whole town judged you unfairly on that platform, and I'm sorry for it." "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt," Willie said, taking her hand. "I confess I've had rather a lot of practice for giving this town's first impressions of me. Yours will hardly be the hardest to set aside. The 10 days that followed moved with a strange compressed urgency, each one bringing some new mini-disaster. Another attempt by Croft's lawyer to discredit Sully's recantation. A rumor that Willie herself had been paid to marry Lucas a night when 3 more head of cattle went missing, in what Amos swore was a deliberate final attempt to strengthen Croft's theft allegations before the hearing. Willie met each twist with the same methodical calm she'd brought to the ledgers that first evening, and by the time Sheriff Adams examined her careful records one evening at the kitchen table, he let out a low whistle of genuine admiration. "Mrs. Reed, if you ever tire of ranch work, the county could use a woman with your eye for detail. Never seen a case built this careful outside a proper courthouse. I have simply learned, Sheriff, that thoroughness is the only defense available to people the world has already decided to underestimate." Amos came to find her the afternoon before the hearing, finding Willie in the study, surrounded by papers organized in neat, careful stacks. "Never seen a body work this hard preparing for a fight that ain't rightly hers to fight," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "It is precisely mine to fight, Mr. Fielding. My name is on that marriage certificate, same as Lucas's." "That ain't what I meant, ma'am. I meant that most women in your position might have let the men handle a legal fight and kept to the kitchen where it's safer. Perhaps because for the first time in my life, Mr. Fielding, somebody has treated me as though my mind and my effort actually mattered to an outcome, rather than merely my hands and my cooking." "Well," Amos said, standing something gruffly approving in his weathered face, "for whatever my opinion's worth, ma'am, I reckon this ranch is lucky to have you fighting for it, whatever the magistrate decides tomorrow." The night before the hearing, Willie found herself unable to sleep. She found Lucas awake too, sitting on the porch step in the dark, staring out at the land Croft was trying to take from him. "Can't sleep either," she said, settling beside him. "10 days ago, I was defending a marriage that didn't exist," Lucas said quietly. "Tomorrow, I'm defending one that does against a man who'll say anything to take what's mine. Are you frightened?" "Some. Not for the land so much, though I've poured near everything I have into this place. Frightened more that if it goes wrong tomorrow, you'll have married into ruin instead of the life I promised you." Lucas Reed. "I stood on a train platform 6 weeks ago with $12 to my name and a trunk full of everything I owned, rejected by a man who looked at me for 4 seconds and decided I wasn't worth keeping. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am not the same frightened woman who climbed into your wagon that day. I did not marry you for security. I married you because for the first time in 9 years, a man looked at me and saw something worth having. That will remain true tomorrow, whether the magistrate rules in our favor or not." Lucas was quiet a long moment. "I don't believe anyone's ever said anything like that to me in my whole life." "Then it was past time somebody did." The morning of the hearing arrived clear and cold, and the county courthouse filled faster than Willie had expected. Harlan Croft sat with his lawyer at one table, composed and confident, while Lucas and Willie sat at the other, with Sheriff Adams's careful notes and Sully's signed statement and the almanac. Croft's lawyer began exactly as Willie had expected, painting Lucas as a desperate man willing to steal and lie and characterizing the marriage as manufactured legitimacy designed to distract from the true matter at hand. "Objection," Willie said, standing before she'd fully decided to. "Your Honor, if counsel intends to characterize my marriage as manufactured, I would ask that he first explain how a genuine ceremony performed by an ordained minister, witnessed by half of Copper Creek's congregation, constitutes manufactured legitimacy in any sense the law recognizes." Magistrate Corwin studied her with something between surprise and interest. "You're not counsel, ma'am." "No, Your Honor. I am the defendant's wife, and I would ask the court's indulgence to speak plainly to matters within my own direct knowledge." "Let her speak," Corwin said. "I find I'm curious what she has to say." Willie stepped forward. "Your Honor, I would like to draw the court's attention to the almanac for the night in question, which shows conclusively that there was no moon visible at all, meaning any witness claiming to have identified cattle brands across a boundary fence in complete darkness is either mistaken or lying." She placed the almanac before the magistrate. I would further draw the court's attention to a signed statement from a man named Sully present in this courtroom today, prepared to testify that he was paid $5 by Mr. Croft's foreman to swear to events he never witnessed. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Croft's face had gone rigid. "Is Mr. Sully present?" Corwin asked. "He is, Your Honor," Sheriff Adams said, standing from the gallery. "Under my protection on account of certain threats made against him should he recant." Sully was called forward, and hands shaking, but voice steady, told the magistrate the full truth of what he'd been paid to say, and why he'd finally refused to say it under oath. Croft's lawyer rose immediately, scrambling to salvage what he could. "Your Honor, even if this witness recants, the pattern of suspicious timing regarding the marriage remains entirely unaddressed." "Your Honor, I would be glad to address that pattern directly," Willie interjected. Corwin waved a hand. "Proceed, Mrs. Reed. The suggestion that our marriage was manufactured presupposes that no genuine arrangement existed prior to Mr. Croft's allegations. Reverend Whitfield's circuit brings him through Copper Creek only once every 3 weeks, a schedule fixed months in advance. We chose our ceremony's date because it was the earliest available on the Reverend's existing schedule, a fact easily confirmed by the Reverend himself present in this courtroom today. Reverend Whitfield rose to confirm exactly that. Croft's face had gone the color of old ash. "Furthermore," Willie continued, "I would ask the court to consider what interest a man with no stake in this marriage's legitimacy would have in questioning it so thoroughly, sending men onto the Double R to intimidate a woman alone in her own yard, planting watchers to report on private domestic details, spreading fabricated rumors about my very identity. These are the actions of a man attempting to manufacture a scandal broad enough to distract this court from the thinness of his actual claim." Objection. Your Honor, counsel is editorializing. "She's not counsel," Corwin said dryly. "Which means she's not bound by the same restrictions, and frankly, Mr. Draper, I find her editorializing considerably more persuasive than your client's evidence thus far. Sit down." By the time the hearing concluded, the boundary survey stood confirmed as accurate, the theft allegations dismissed entirely, and Harlan Croft himself faced the beginning of a thorough investigation into witness tampering and fraudulent legal complaints. "This isn't finished, Reed," Croft hissed as he was escorted from the courthouse. "You and your wife have made a powerful enemy today." "Funny thing about enemies, Croft," Lucas said, standing with Willie's hand firm in his. "They tend to lose their power once the truth finally catches up with their lies." Lucas found her hand amid the dispersing crowd, and when she looked up at him, he wasn't watching the departing carriage at all. He was watching her. "You did that," he said quietly once they were alone on the courthouse steps. "Every bit of that." "We did that, Lucas. Together. No, I mended fence and lost sleep, but you built the whole case that saved this ranch. I don't know that I've ever met anyone like you, Willie Dawson." "Reed," she corrected softly this time, no longer testing the name, but claiming it. "Willie Reed, if you please, Mr. Reed." Something broke open in his face at that warm and unguarded, and he laughed real and full. "Willie Reed," he repeated. "I like the sound of that considerably more than I expected to, given how this whole arrangement started. As do I, Lucas." She let herself lean into him fully, without the careful restraint she'd maintained through every public performance of the past 10 days. "Though I confess, I did not imagine standing on that platform 6 weeks ago, with $12 and a trunk full of everything I owned, that I would end up here, married in truth, respected in a courtroom, standing beside a man who fought for me as hard as I fought for him." "Rejection's a strange thing," Lucas said. "Walton rejected you in 4 seconds flat, and I've spent 6 weeks since being grateful every single day that he did, because it's the only reason I ever got the chance to know you at all." Willie felt tears prick unexpectedly at that warm and unashamed. "I begin to think, Mr. Reed, that some rejections are simply doors closing so that better ones might open." "Then I'm grateful for every closed door that led you to mine," Lucas said, and pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and unhurried, right there on the courthouse steps, in front of whatever remained of Copper Creek's curious eyes. She was simply finally being watched with love. The weeks that followed the hearing carried a different kind of urgency than the 10 days before it. Quieter but no less demanding, as the investigation Magistrate Corwin had promised began slowly, and then all at once, to unravel the full scope of what Harlan Croft had built. It started with a letter delivered to the Double R by a writer Willie didn't recognize, requesting her presence at the county courthouse to provide testimony regarding the ranch's financial records during the period of the disputed boundary claim. "They want your ledgers," Lucas said, reading over her shoulder, something grim and satisfied crossing his face in equal measure. Corwin's building a real case against him now, not just dismissing the theft complaint. "Then I'll give them every ledger I've kept since the day I arrived," Willie said, already pulling the relevant books from the study shelf. "If Croft's been manipulating more than just our boundary dispute, careful records are exactly what will prove it." The investigator assigned to the case, a lean, quiet man named Garrett, sent down from the territorial capital, arrived 3 days later, and spent the better part of a week combing through every document Willie had prepared, asking questions with the patient thoroughness of a man who'd seen enough corruption to recognize its shape, even when it wore a respectable coat. "You kept meticulous records, Mrs. Reed," Garrett said, on the 4th day, looking up from a stack of correspondence Willie had organized by date. "Most households in a dispute this size, I find records scattered incomplete, easy to dismiss as circumstantial. Yours tell a story a magistrate could follow blindfolded. I have found, Mr. Garrett, that a woman's word alone rarely satisfies people inclined to doubt her. Documents satisfy where character testimony does not." "Well, your documents have done considerably more than satisfy," Garrett said. "They've opened a door into something a good deal larger than one boundary dispute." "Larger how?" Lucas asked, setting down the coffee he'd been nursing. Croft's dealings with the feed store, the freight company, even the assay office where he had cattle weighed before sale, they all show a pattern once you lay them side by side the way your wife's done here. Money moving in directions that don't match any legitimate business a rancher his size ought to be conducting. "You're saying this goes beyond our boundary dispute," Willie said, feeling the shape of something larger beginning to form. "I'm saying, Mrs. Reed, that in 15 years doing this work I've rarely seen a case built as thoroughly as the one sitting in your study right now, and I intend to use every page of it." Willie felt a flush of something she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, though there was pride in it, but a kind of quiet vindication. The particular satisfaction of watching years of being dismissed as merely capable of keeping house prove finally decisively that her mind had always been worth far more than that narrow measure. The twist came 2 days after that, sharp and unexpected, when Garrett returned from town with news that stopped Willie mid-stitch at the mending she'd been working through. "Croft's bank records," Garrett said, settling heavy into a kitchen chair Amos offered him. "The Territorial Bank cooperated with a proper warrant, and what we found explains a great deal more than cattle theft and a disputed survey. Croft's been paying regular sums to no fewer than 6 ranchers across 3 counties, all disguised as loan repayments, all timed suspiciously close to boundary disputes. Those ranchers eventually lost or settled in Croft's favor." "Bribery," Lucas said flat. "Bribery, coercion, and in at least 2 cases outright fraud, where survey documents were altered after the fact to shift boundary lines in Croft's favor before the original surveyors could be consulted to correct the record." Willie felt something cold and clarifying settle over her. "How many ranchers total?" "We believe as many as 9 going back 6 years. Some settled quiet, took Croft's money, and moved on rather than fight a man with unlimited resources for a legal battle. Others simply lost their land outright when they couldn't afford to counter his lawyers. 9 families." Willie repeated, thinking of her own 6 weeks of fear and exhaustion fighting just one dispute, multiplying that weight across 9 households who'd faced it without the resources she and Lucas had managed to assemble. 9 families who likely believed, same as we nearly did, that a man with Croft's money simply could not be beaten. That's precisely the reputation he's built his empire on, Mrs. Reed. Fear that fighting him costs more than losing to him quietly. Then perhaps, Willie said, feeling something fierce and purposeful take root in her chest. It's past time somebody proved that reputation wrong publicly enough that other families find their own courage to come forward. Garrett studied her with the same careful respect Sheriff Adams had shown weeks before. "That's precisely why I've come to ask something of you directly, Mrs. Reed. The territorial prosecutor believes your testimony and the documentation you've already provided could serve as the foundation for a broader case. Would you be willing to testify, not just to your own family's dispute, but to help other families understand how to organize similar evidence against him?" Willie looked at Lucas, saw the same fierce protective pride in his eyes that she'd come to recognize as entirely his own particular way of loving her. "I would be honored, Mr. Garrett, though I confess I never expected arriving in this territory as a rejected bride with $12 to my name that I would end up helping unravel a corrupt land baron's entire criminal enterprise. Life takes strange turns, ma'am." Garrett said something almost like a smile crossing his weathered face. "Seems this territory's fortunate you took the turn you did." Word of the broadening investigation spread through Copper Creek faster than any gossip Willie had yet witnessed, and with it came a shift in the town's regard for her that she hadn't quite anticipated. Women who'd once whispered behind gloved hands at her arrival now stopped her in the mercantile to ask genuine curiosity, replacing old cruelty, how she'd managed to organize such thorough records against a man everyone had assumed untouchable. "I simply wrote down what happened plain and honest as it occurred." Willie told one such woman, a rancher's wife named Sarah Coleman, whose own family had quietly settled a boundary dispute with Croft 2 years prior, rather than risk a costly legal fight. "I imagine your own recollection of your dispute would prove just as valuable, Mrs. Coleman, if you're willing to share it with the investigator." Sarah's face went pale, old fear visible beneath the surface. "I don't know that my husband would want that trouble stirred up again, Mrs. Reed. Croft's a dangerous man to cross." "He was a dangerous man to cross," Willie said gently, "when everyone believed challenging him meant fighting alone. But you needn't fight alone any longer, Mrs. Coleman. There's an investigator now, a magistrate already inclined to believe the pattern, and 8 other families whose stories added to yours make a case considerably harder to dismiss than any single family's word against his money." It took Sarah Coleman 3 more days to work up her courage, but she came to the Double R on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, her husband trailing nervous behind her, and sat at Willie's kitchen table telling a story of intimidation and forced settlement that mirrored their own ordeal almost exactly. "I never thought anybody would believe us over a man with Croft's money," Sarah admitted once she'd finished wiping at unexpected tears. "Everyone believed a great many things about me too, Mrs. Coleman, when I stood on that train platform 6 weeks past," Willie said, taking the woman's hand across the table. "That I wasn't worth keeping, that my worth began and ended with what a man happened to want from a mail-order bride. I have since learned that what people believe about a person, however widely held, isn't always the truth of the matter. One family's courage led to another's, and within 2 weeks, Garrett's investigation had gathered testimony from 6 of the 9 families Croft had allegedly wronged." Sarah Coleman came to visit again the following week, this time with her husband walking beside her instead of trailing nervous behind both of them, carrying an ease Willie hadn't seen in either of them before. "The prosecutor says our case is stronger with yours added to it," Sarah said, settling at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee Willie set before her. "Says between the 2 families, plus the others come forward. Now there's near enough evidence to put that man away for the rest of his natural life." "I'm glad, Sarah. Truly. I don't believe I've properly thanked you," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "Watching you stand up in that courtroom, seeing how a woman everybody once whispered about turned around and outsmarted the most powerful man in this territory, it gave me courage I didn't know I still had in me. We none of us do these things entirely alone, Sarah, whatever the story might look like from outside it. You found your own courage. I merely offered you a reason to trust it was worth using." Word of the growing case spread through the territory in a way that shifted gradually, and then all at once the particular regard Copper Creek held for Willie Reed. The same women who'd once watched her humiliation on the platform with curious detachment now greeted her by name in the mercantile, asked her opinion on matters ranging from household accounts to fair dealing with the land office. Mrs. Pruitt in particular seemed determined to make amends beyond her single apology outside the church, and took to setting aside the finest bolts of fabric whenever new shipments arrived, insisting Willie have first choice before other customers. "I confess I hardly recognize this town some days," Willie admitted to Lucas one evening. "The same streets that watched me abandoned with a shawl and $12 now seem almost eager to claim me as one of their own." "Towns are fickle creatures," Lucas said, quick to judge and slower to admit when their judgment proved wrong. "But I don't imagine you need Copper Creek's approval to know your own worth, given everything you've proven these past weeks, without a single soul's permission." "No," Willie agreed. "I don't need it. But I confess it's a good deal more pleasant to receive it than to do without." The deeper twist arrived when Garrett returned from the territorial capital with news that changed the shape of everything Willie had assumed about the scope of Croft's ambitions. "It's not simply land, Mrs. Reed," Garrett said, spreading a fresh set of documents across the kitchen table. "We've traced payments from Croft's accounts to 2 territorial land office clerks going back nearly 4 years. Falsified survey approvals, backdated filings records altered after the fact to support boundary claims that had no legitimate basis at all. This isn't one man bullying his neighbors, ma'am. This is systematic corruption, reaching into the very office meant to protect fair land claims across this entire territory." Lucas's face had gone hard and still. "How far up does it go?" "Far enough that the territorial governor's office has taken direct interest now. What started as your boundary dispute has become, I'm afraid, the thread that's finally unraveling something considerably larger than any of us anticipated when this began." Willie sat with that weight a long moment, thinking of the shawl that had hit the dirt on a train platform weeks before, thinking of James Walton's back as he walked away, without once looking behind him, thinking of how impossibly small that humiliation now seemed measured against the scope of what her careful record-keeping had ultimately helped expose. "I confess, Mr. Garrett, I never imagined a rejected mail-order bride's ledgers might one day matter to a territorial governor." "Ma'am, at this point, I don't imagine much surprises me about what you're capable of," Garrett said. The arrest, when it finally came, arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning without fanfare. Sheriff Adams rode out personally to inform them. "Croft's in custody," he said simply. "Territorial marshals took him at his own ranch this morning. Fraud, bribery, witness tampering, and enough counts of falsified land documents to keep the territorial court occupied for the better part of a year. And the families he wronged. Territorial prosecutors already discussing restitution for the ranchers who lost land outright." "That's because of you," Lucas said once Sheriff Adams had ridden off, turning to Willie with something unguarded and full in his expression. "Every bit of it, Willie. Your ledgers started this. Your patience with Sully started this. Your courage in that courtroom started this. 9 families are getting some measure of justice today because a woman nobody in this territory thought worth listening to refused to stop documenting the truth. We started this together, Lucas. I only kept the records. You're the one who offered a stranger dignity on a train platform when the whole town was ready to watch her humiliation as entertainment." Amos, overhearing from the doorway, cleared his throat with poorly disguised emotion. "For what it's worth, ma'am, this ranch has had considerably more excitement since you arrived than in the 3 years previous, and I don't believe I've minded a single day of it. High praise, Mr. Fielding, from a man who once eyed me with such open suspicion in this very yard." "Man's allowed to revise his opinion, Mrs. Reed. Reckon I revised mine somewhere around the 2nd week when I watched you turn this whole falling-apart household into something worth coming home to." Danny found her in the study one afternoon during that same stretch of quiet weeks, holding a page of sums he'd worked through entirely on his own pride, written plain across his young face. "Worked these out myself, Mrs. Reed, without asking Amos nor anybody else for help." Willie checked the figures, carefully found them correct down to the last column. "Danny, these are entirely right. Every single sum. Figured maybe, seeing as you've helped bring down the most powerful man in this whole territory, teaching me my numbers oughtn't be too hard a task by comparison." Willie laughed, warm and genuine. "Amos says I might make foreman myself someday, was I to keep learning like this." "I don't doubt it one bit," Willie said, and meant it fully. The weeks that followed the arrest brought their own quieter satisfactions. the kind that didn't announce themselves with courtroom drama, but settled instead into the steady rhythm of a life finally free from the shadow that had hung over it since Willie's arrival. The disputed boundary was formally confirmed in the Double R's favor. The stolen cattle, or their fair value, was returned through the restitution process. And Willie found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply living, rather than merely surviving each new crisis as it arrived. It was on one such ordinary evening that Lucas found her in the study, reviewing the ranch's quarterly accounts, the ledgers now a source of quiet pride rather than the crisis they'd once represented. "You've turned this ranch's fortunes around entirely," he said. "Profits up considerably from where they stood when you arrived. Not a single account overdue anywhere I can find." I had good material to work with once I understood the true shape of the problem. "Is that what you'd call yourself?" "Someone keeping proper account." "What would you call me, Lucas Reed, if not that?" "A partner," he said simply. "Not a housekeeper who happened to marry the man who hired her. A partner in every sense that matters, who's rebuilt this ranch's finances, exposed a corrupt land baron's entire criminal enterprise, and taught my ranch hand, his letters besides all, while I stood mostly out of her way, marveling at what she was capable of." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Willie's chest at the plainness of it. "I have not felt like merely a housekeeper in a very long while, Lucas, if I'm honest. Somewhere between the ledgers and the fence line and that courtroom, I stopped feeling like a woman merely surviving circumstance, and started feeling like a woman actually building something worth having." "Good," Lucas said, quiet and certain, "because I intend for you to keep building it right alongside me for however many years we're fortunate enough to share this land together." "Then I accept the partnership, Mr. Reed, same as I accepted your offer that very first day, though I confess this arrangement suits me considerably better than the last." That evening, over a supper, Willie had prepared with considerably more confidence than the anxious first meal she'd cooked in this same kitchen weeks before. Lucas raised a question that had clearly been sitting with him a while. "Do you ever think on Boston?" he asked. "On the life you might have had there had Walton never sent for you at all?" "I think on it rarely, and when I do, I find myself grateful rather than wistful. Boston offered me a life of being tolerated, Lucas. This territory offered me a life of being needed, respected, and ultimately loved." "I confess I think on that platform often," Lucas admitted. "Wonder sometimes what might have happened had I ridden into town an hour later." "Then I'm grateful you didn't." "Amos tells me half the county's talking about the case now," Lucas said. "Says folks as far as the territorial capital are asking after the rancher's wife who brought down Harlan Croft with nothing but a ledger book and a level head." "I did not bring him down single-handedly, Lucas. I merely refuse to let his lies stand unchallenged, same as I refuse to let Walton's humiliation define the whole of my worth." "Modesty doesn't suit you nearly so well as competence does, Willie Reed." It was into that comfortable, ordinary evening that Danny burst into the study without knocking, breathless with news that pulled them both back from the quiet moment they'd been sharing. "Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed, there's a letter come for you official looking from the territorial capital." Willie took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. She broke the seal and read, and felt her breath catch at the words waiting inside. "What is it?" Lucas asked. "The territorial governor's office," Willie said slowly. "They're requesting my presence at the Capitol next month to advise on new land office oversight procedures, given my role in exposing the corruption that allowed Croft's operation to flourish undetected for so many years. They want you to help write policy. It appears so, yes. A woman who arrived in this territory with $12 and a rejected marriage proposal, asked now to advise a territorial governor on preventing exactly the kind of corruption that nearly destroyed everything you'd built." "Willie Reed." Lucas said something fierce and proud in his voice. "I don't believe there's a soul in this territory who'd argue you haven't earned that invitation twice over." That evening, as they sat together on the porch step, where Lucas had once confessed his fears the night before the hearing, Willie found herself turning the letter over in her hands. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "what became of James Walton? Whether he knows what his rejection ultimately led to, I imagine he knows nothing beyond his own satisfaction at having avoided marrying a woman he decided in 4 seconds flat wasn't what he'd asked for, Lucas said. I doubt he's spent a single moment considering what became of you since, or that he'd believe it if he heard. I find I don't much care whether he knows or believes it, Willie said, and discovered saying it aloud that the words were entirely true. His rejection stopped mattering to me somewhere between the ledgers and the fence line, and that courtroom Lucas. I am no longer the woman he looked at and found wanting. You always were, Lucas said softly, drawing her close against his side. Walton simply lacked the eyes to see it. Took a rancher with burnt biscuits and a falling-apart pantry to recognize what was standing right in front of him. Willie laughed at that, real and unguarded, and leaned into him fully. Watching the last light fade over land that was in every sense that mattered now, entirely and completely her own. Amos and Danny joined them on the porch a while later, drawn by the easy sound of laughter carrying across the yard, and the four of them sat together as the stars came out proper over the double R. Territorial governor asking a Copper Creek rancher's wife for advice, Amos said, shaking his head with something like wonder. Never thought I'd see a day like that in this territory, not in all my years working this land. Nor did I, Mr. Fielding, Willie admitted. Though I've learned this past year that the days I least expect often prove the ones that matter most. You'll write me while you're at the Capitol? Danny asked, a note of genuine worry creeping into his young voice. I'll write you every week, Danny, and I expect, by the time I return, you'll have solved whatever puzzles arise without needing my help at all. The boy beamed at that pride and affection plain across his face. Later, once Amos and Danny had retired for the night, Lucas turned to her with something soft and lasting in his expression. Whatever the governor's office asks of you, Willie, whatever this territory comes to owe you for what you've uncovered, I want you to know, none of it changes what matters most to me. You could have stayed simply a housekeeper, kept your head down. Instead, you chose to fight for yourself, for this ranch, for families you'd never even met. That's the woman I married, and that's the woman I intend to keep loving for every year we're given together. Then I am fortunate twice over, Willie said softly. Once for the home you offered a stranger on a train platform, and again for the man who stood beside me every single day since, never once asking me to be smaller than I actually am. The wind moved soft across the yard, carrying the particular piece of a home finally fully secured against every threat that had once shadowed it. And Willie Reed sat beneath a sky full of stars, beside the man who had never let her stand alone again, understanding at last, completely and without reservation, that the worst morning of her life had simply been the door swinging open toward the best one. The morning Willie left for the territorial capital, Lucas insisted on driving her to the train station himself, though Amos had offered twice already, and Willie suspected the insistence had less to do with practicality than with some private reluctance he hadn't yet put into words. You'll be gone 3 weeks, he said, loading her trunk into the wagon with considerably more care than he'd shown loading it that very first day when she'd been a stranger with nothing left to lose. Longest we've been apart since you arrived. 3 weeks isn't so very long, Lucas. No, he agreed, though something in his voice suggested he didn't quite believe it. I expect it'll feel longer than it is. The ride to the station passed quieter than their first ride together had, though the silence now carried none of the raw shock of that earlier journey, replaced instead by something comfortable and full. The particular quiet of two people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel close. It was at the platform itself that Willie felt the strange vertiginous pull of memory, standing in nearly the same spot where a shawl had once hit the dirt, where James Walton's cruel dismissal had once broken something in her she'd assumed might never properly heal. You've gone quiet, Lucas observed, watching her face. I was thinking of the last time I stood on a platform like this one, Willie admitted. How different this leaving feels from that arriving. How so? That day, I stood here believing I had nothing left, that I was being sent away by circumstance, with no say in where I landed. Today, I stand here choosing to go, knowing precisely what waits for me on my return. She looked at him. That is no small difference, Lucas Reed. No, he agreed, and drew her into an embrace that drew a few curious glances from other travelers on the platform, though neither of them cared one whit this time. "Write me the moment you arrive. I'll not rest easy till I know you've reached the capital safe. I'll write you every single day, same as I promised Danny." The train's whistle sounded sharp and final, and Willie felt the old familiar lurch of departure, except this time it carried none of the terror that had once accompanied it, only the ordinary ache of leaving someone she loved for a purpose that mattered. The territorial capital proved larger and considerably more overwhelming than Copper Creek, full of government buildings and busy streets, and a particular formal bustle Willie hadn't experienced since Boston, though this bustle felt different somehow, charged with purpose, rather than the empty social performance she'd once endured in her aunt's parlor. Governor Whitmore himself greeted her on her first morning at the Capitol, a tall, silver-haired man, whose reputation for plain speaking preceded him considerably. "Mrs. Reed," he said, extending a hand with genuine warmth. "I confess I've heard a great deal about the woman who single-handedly unraveled Harlan Croft's entire criminal enterprise armed with nothing but a ledger book and a level head. I did not accomplish it single-handedly, Governor. 9 families' courage, an honest investigator, and a husband willing to fight beside me every step of the way all played their part." "Modesty," Whitmore observed, "though I suspect considerable steel sits underneath it, given the reports I've read of your courtroom testimony." "I have found, Governor, that steel and modesty needn't be mutually exclusive qualities in a woman, whatever this territory may have once assumed to the contrary." Whitmore laughed at that, genuine and appreciative. "Well said, Mrs. Reed. Now shall we discuss the matter at hand? I understand you've thoughts on how the land office oversight might be structured to prevent another Croft from ever operating so freely again." Willie spent the better part of her first week in careful consultation with land office officials, reviewing the specific mechanisms Croft had exploited, suggesting reforms with the same methodical precision she'd once brought to Lucas's tangled ledgers. "You understand these mechanisms better than clerks who've worked the land office for decades, Mrs. Reed," one official remarked. "How does a rancher's wife come to grasp bureaucratic procedure so thoroughly?" "I did not grasp it thoroughly at first, sir. I simply asked the same careful questions of every document Croft's fraud touched that I once asked of a badly kept ledger, and found the pattern of his corruption no different in kind from the pattern of any household's mismanaged accounts, merely larger in scale and considerably more damaging in consequence." By her third day, the committee reviewing her recommendations had grown considerably more animated in their discussions, several officials openly acknowledging that her proposed verification system, requiring independent confirmation of any boundary survey before formal filing, would have caught Croft's fraud years earlier had it existed at the time. This single provision, one committee member noted, might have saved 9 families their land entirely. Mrs. Reed had it been law when Croft began his scheme. "Then I hope it saves the next 9 families this territory would otherwise fail to protect." The twist arrived on her 4th day at the Capitol, unexpected and unwelcome, in the form of a visit from a lawyer Willie recognized instantly, though she'd only ever seen him once before arguing on Croft's behalf in the county courthouse. "Mrs. Reed," the man said, finding her in the corridor outside the governor's office. "A moment of your time if you'd be so kind." "Mr. Draper, I confess I'm surprised to find you here." "I'm here on a different matter entirely, ma'am. My client, Mr. Croft, has authorized me to make you an offer." Willie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I cannot imagine what offer your client believes I would entertain, Mr. Draper, given everything his corruption has cost so many families across this territory." "A generous settlement, ma'am, in exchange for softening your testimony regarding the land office oversight recommendations. My client faces considerably harsher sentencing if the policies you're currently advising become law." "You are asking me to accept a bribe," Mr. Draper dressed up in polite legal language. "I am asking you to consider that my client still holds considerable resources, ma'am, even facing prison, and that resources have a way of finding their targets regardless of distance or time passed." Willie felt the threat beneath the polite phrasing land plain and unmistakable, and found to her own quiet surprise that it did not frighten her the way it might have 6 months before. "Mr. Draper, I stood on a train platform once with $12 to my name, humiliated by a man who decided in 4 seconds I wasn't worth keeping. I have since survived far worse threats than whatever veiled warning you're currently offering. You may tell your client that my testimony will remain exactly as thorough and exactly as honest as it has been from the very first day, and that any further attempt to threaten me, veiled or otherwise, will find its way directly into my next report to the governor's office. You understand, ma'am, that men like Croft don't easily accept defeat. I understand, Mr. Draper, that men like Croft have already lost considerably more than they realized the moment they decided a woman's testimony could be bought or frightened into silence. I would also remind you that threatening a witness cooperating with a territorial investigation carries its own considerable legal consequence. Good day to you. She reported the encounter to Governor Whitmore within the hour, watched his expression harden into something grim and determined. This will go into the official record. Mrs. Reed and I intend to see Draper investigated for attempted witness intimidation. You did precisely right refusing him. The deeper twist came 3 days later, when Willie received an unexpected letter, not from Lucas, whose careful, steady correspondence had arrived faithfully each day since her departure, but from an address in Copper Creek she didn't immediately recognize. She broke the seal with cautious curiosity and felt her breath catch at the signature waiting at the letter's close. James Walton, Miss Dawson, Mrs. Reed. I understand now. I write this letter with considerable difficulty, having heard through the territory's gossip of everything you've accomplished since the day I sent you away at the station. I confess I did not treat you fairly that day, nor in the weeks of letters preceding it. I judged you by a measure that had nothing to do with your actual worth. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I believe I have earned any explanation beyond the plain truth. I was a foolish man who mistook a woman's appearance for the whole of her value, and I have lost considerably more by that mistake than you ever lost by my rejection of you. I wish you continued success and happiness. Willie sat with the letter a long while, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, reaching not for anger, but for something closer to distant pity. She wrote back only briefly, Mr. Walton, I accept your apology, though I confess I no longer require it the way I once might have. Your rejection, however cruel in the moment, led me directly to a life considerably richer than anything I believe you could have offered me. I wish you well, and I hope you find eventually a measure of the same grace you failed to extend to me that day on the platform. She sealed the letter and sent it, and felt closing that particular chapter of her story a lightness she hadn't quite expected. Lucas's letters arrived faithfully throughout her 3 weeks at the Capitol, each one carrying small updates from the ranch alongside declarations of affection that grew steadily less careful, less guarded, as the distance between them stretched on. Danny solved a whole page of sums without a single error yesterday. One letter read and insisted I write you immediately to share the news on account of you promising to be proud of him. Amos asks after you daily read another, though he'd never admit outright how much he misses your presence at supper. The pantry's holding steady read a third with the particular dry humor Willie had come to treasure in him. Though I confess, Amos and I have reverted to burnt beans twice this week in your absence, and Bandit seems to have taken your departure personally. I find myself thinking, most evenings read a fourth arriving just days before her scheduled return of that first night you spent under this roof, tired and frightened, and trying so hard to hide it behind that careful composure of yours. I did not know then how thoroughly you would come to fill every corner of this house and this life. I know it now plainly, and I find myself counting the days until you're home to fill it again. Her final meeting with Governor Whitmore the morning before her departure brought news that settled the last remaining thread of her time in the Capitol. The new oversight legislation passes committee review next month. Mrs. Reed built substantially on the framework you helped design. I intend to see your name formally recognized in the official record. I am honored, Governor, though I confess I'm equally eager to return to the considerably smaller concerns of my own household. A woman capable of unraveling territorial corruption and still preferring the quiet concerns of home and hearth. Should you ever tire of ranch life, there will always be a place for you here. Lucas was waiting at the platform when the train finally pulled in, and Willie felt her breath catch at the sight of him standing exactly where he'd stood the day they'd first met. Though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "You came for me," she said, feeling suddenly foolishly close to tears. "Where else would I be, Willie Reed, the day my wife returns home?" The ride back to the Double R passed in comfortable, easy conversation. "Tell me about Draper," Lucas said. "You mentioned him briefly in your last letter, but I could tell there was more to the encounter than you'd written down." Willie recounted the confrontation in full, watching Lucas's jaw tighten with the particular controlled fury she'd come to recognize from the earliest days of Croft's intimidation. "He threatened you directly in a government building and thought he'd get away with it. I have grown rather accustomed to standing my own ground these past months, Lucas, though I confess your presence remains considerably preferred." Amos and Danny greeted her return with open enthusiasm, Danny practically vibrating with eagerness to show her his latest arithmetic progress. "Ranch missed you something fierce, Mrs. Reed," Amos said. "Boss here's been near unbearable moping about like a man who'd lost something precious." "I was not moping, Amos." "You were moping considerable, boss, and there ain't no shame admitting it in front of the woman who caused it." That evening, sitting once again on the porch step, Willie told Lucas about the letter from James Walton. "How do you feel about it?" "I feel, Lucas, that his apology closes a chapter I had already, without quite realizing it, finished writing some months before he thought to offer it." Croft's sentencing arrived that autumn. Sheriff Adams rode out personally to deliver the news. 15 years, Mrs. Reed, with restitution ordered for every family he wronged. I confess I did not expect arriving here with $12 and a broken engagement that I would one day help put away the most powerful man in this entire territory. For what it's worth, Mrs. Reed, I've served this county 15 years, and I don't believe I've ever watched a single person accomplish what you managed starting from so little. It was on an ordinary evening the following spring that Lucas found her in the kitchen, and something in his expression suggested a question he'd been turning over for some while. "I've been thinking about what comes next for us, Willie, now that Croft's threat is finally settled. This house has always felt too large for the two of us alone. Same as I told you that very first day, though I mean something rather different by it now." Lucas Reed: "Are you asking what I believe you're asking?" "I'm asking whether you might want children, Willie. I've watched you these past months teaching Danny his letters, coaxing truth from a frightened witness, with nothing but patience and kindness. And I find myself imagining what kind of mother you'd make. I confess the imagining has grown rather difficult to set aside." "I want that very much, Lucas. I find myself wanting it fiercely now that you've asked." The following year brought its own share of small ordinary miracles, culminating in the birth of a daughter, Willie and Lucas, named Grace, born on a clear autumn morning with her father's steady calm, and as she grew, her mother's sharp, unyielding intelligence. "She has your eyes," Lucas said. "She has your stubbornness already, if her grip on my finger is any indication." Danny, grown considerably in the years since Willie's arrival, held little Grace with careful, awkward tenderness. "Been meaning to tell you, Mrs. Reed. Took the foreman's exam last month. Passed it clean on account of the numbers work you taught me all those years back." "Danny, that's wonderful news. I'm so very proud of you. Wouldn't have managed it without you seeing something in me nobody else bothered looking for." Amos touched one weathered finger, gentle to baby Grace's tiny hand. "Welcome to the world, little one. You've got yourself a fine family waiting to spoil you rotten." That evening, once the small gathering had dispersed, Willie sat with Lucas on the porch step, watching stars emerge slow and steady. "Do you ever think of that first day?" Lucas asked. "The platform, the shawl. I think of it often. Not with pain any longer, but with a kind of distant gratitude. That humiliation broke something in me, Lucas, something I believed might never properly heal. But it broke in precisely the direction that led me toward you. James Walton did us both an unwitting kindness that day. His rejection was never truly about my worth, Lucas. It was about his own narrow vision, his own failure to see what stood plainly in front of him. You saw it instead from the very first moment, and you have never once let me forget it since. I intend to keep reminding you of it for every single year we're fortunate enough to share Willie Reed." She had arrived in this territory believing herself unwanted, discarded by a man who measured her worth in appearance alone and found her lacking. That morning had seemed at the time like the absolute end of everything she had hoped her life might become. But that morning had not been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, disguised as devastation. A door slamming shut so violently that she had stumbled broken and frightened directly into the arms of a man who would spend every day thereafter proving that her worth had never once depended on anyone else's narrow judgment. Rejection, Willie understood now, was rarely the verdict it appeared to be in the terrible moment of its delivery. It was simply life's blunt, occasionally cruel method of clearing away what was never meant to last, making room for what actually was. James Walton had looked at her for 4 seconds and decided she was not what he had asked for. He had been entirely correct, though not in the way he had intended. She was not what he had asked for. She was something considerably more than that. She was Willie Reed, now wife, partner, mother, and proof beyond any doubt that a person's worth is never decided by a stranger's careless glance. The rejection that once broke her had become the very thing that set her free, and nothing that came after could ever take that truth away from her again.